Welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining me today. We are here to talk about whether or not your organization is really ready for a major campaign this year. So if you're just joining us, come on in. Let me know where you're joining from. I always love to hear this. And otherwise, we're going to dive right in because we have about 25 minutes and we're going to cover a lot of ground today. All right, so if we haven't met yet, I wanted to introduce myself. Hi, I am Emma Luzzi, CFRE, and I'm the founder of Blue Sky Philanthropy. And I work with major gift teams to help you develop the skills, the strategies, and the systems that you need to hit your ambitious campaign goals. So, welcome here. And I wanted to start off just by saying, I know that many fundraisers are being handed very ambitious goals. Sometimes we're just handed a goal and we're handed a very ambitious goal with a simple directive: make this happen. We've all been there as fundraisers, right? So for me, the real question isn't, can we run a campaign? The question is, should we actually run a campaign right now? So this is a time I want to hear from you. Hello, Laura is iced in Annapolis. I feel you. We had a lot of snow, so we're just digging out. Nan, welcome. Good to see some familiar faces here. So I want you to, hey Freya, also more familiar faces. Chrissy joining us from Leamington. Stephanie, welcome. Laura, wow, in $100 million campaign. This can be also a handy session as well if you find you hit some sticking points. So I think you'll get a lot out of this, whether or not you are in campaign or in campaign planning mode. Now, I want to hear from you. I want you to drop a yes in the comments if you've ever been handed a campaign goal before there was a real organizational conversation about campaign readiness. Let's hear from you. I want you to drop a yes if you've ever been handed an ambitious goal before you've actually talked about whether or not the organization is ready. Okay, I'd love to hear from you on this. Oh, and I'm going to go over and make sure we are. All right. Yes. Yeah. I'm getting some capital. I'm getting some all caps yeses here. So there's an enthusiastic yeses. This is a super common problem. And one of the things I want to start addressing in this session today is the things that you actually need to look at to ensure that you are ready to hit your campaign goal. And I want to start off just to make sure we're all on the same page by talking about what campaign readiness typically includes. Now, we're together for a short time today, so this is not going to be absolutely exhaustive. I want to be clear about that. But these are some really common pillars, some common areas that I want you to be paying close attention to when you're thinking about your campaign readiness. So first and foremost, we're going to dive into this more deeply in a moment. We need leadership alignment. And when I say leadership alignment, I'm thinking about the CEO. I'm thinking about the board. I'm thinking about your executive leadership team. Anyone in a leadership role, we all need to be absolutely on the same page. We need clear agreement on priorities, on the scope, and a word a lot of leaders don't like to hear, the trade-offs that might need to be happening in order to enable you to put on a campaign with the goal, the size that you are targeting. Second, we want to think about fundraising infrastructure. Ideally, you have an established and well-functioning major gift program. Again, if this is a gap, it's not the end of the world, but it's important for us to be aware of this so you can actually start putting that infrastructure in place, start building that foundation that you need for campaign success. All right, the third thing we'll be talking about today is donor readiness. That means those engaged, deep relationships with folks that you need to ensure your campaign is successful. And we'll be talking about what that is and what it isn't later on in the session. And finally, I just want to talk a bit about organizational capacity. That's even beyond your fundraising infrastructure, because a big capital or comprehensive campaign is a huge organizational commitment. It's not something that can just be delegated to one person, to one team. You need organizational capacity across the board. That means staff, that means systems, that means sometimes financial systems, and the decision making that you need to be able to sustain a multi-year effort. So we're going to be diving a little deeper into each of these, but I wanted to actually start off with, what is readiness sometimes confused with? You may have heard some of these quotes. Sometimes we actually confuse readiness with, we just need this money. We need this money. We're ready to go. We need to open up that new building. We need to make these renovations. We need to expand this program reach. We need this, so we are going to set the target for what we need and launch this campaign. Now, we all know as fundraisers, the need and the case is absolutely crucial, but a successful campaign is never built on a compelling case alone. So we have to be careful. Just because we have a strong and compelling need does not mean that we are ready to launch a campaign. I sometimes also hear the board wants it. The board set a target. The board thinks we're ready. The board has maybe looked outside the organization to another organization in your community, maybe a hospital, maybe a university, and they've said, well, if they can do it, I think we should be doing it too, right? But the trick there is, I often call campaign planning a bit of an iceberg, right? Like with an iceberg, you only see a very small amount of what contributes to campaign success above the waterline. And a lot of this readiness and planning work actually happens behind the scenes. No matter how big an organization you're at, no matter how big a campaign you're in, what your board is not seeing is the amount of pre-planning, the months and even years of pre-planning that happen before a campaign goes public. So sometimes readiness is confused with board direction. We need this money. We've set this goal. We think we can do it. That's great if your board is on board, but there is more to it than that, as we all know. I also have recently heard organizations kind of looking back at past success and leaning on past success. Oh, we ran a campaign, 5, 10 years ago. I've even heard longer periods of time than that. We had no problem then. We didn't have a plan. We didn't do any feasibility work. We just set our goal. We hit our goal. No problem. So we're going to do that again. And my message to you here is the landscape has changed significantly. The landscape has changed significantly in the past 5 years, let alone 10 years. So I always caution organizations about leaning too heavily on past success, on the way you've done this in the past, because it's not necessarily going to serve you well in 2026, right? So these are things that we often hear that are a little bit readiness gets confused with. So I just wanted to kind of clear that up right away, right? I also want to talk a little bit more about these gaps that we see typically that organizations can overlook. And this is where I'm going to dive more deeply into each of those readiness pillars I talked about earlier. So we're talking about leadership alignment. The gap we sometimes see is leadership misalignment. Here's a very common one. I'm going to ask you to also drop let's use the word launch. I want you to drop the word launch into the comments if you are working with a board or a CEO that wants you to launch and go public with your goal earlier than you should be. So there's a perception internally that the only way we're going to be successful is if we go public with this big goal, right? There's a misunderstanding there around well-structured campaigns. Laura, thankfully, no. I was presenting recently at a conference and I put up a slide that said, your CEO is going to want to launch before you are ready. And it was probably my most photographed slide of all time. And I even had some bold folks actually texting this slide to their CEOs, because there's a real keenness and there's a real perception that you actually need to launch and go public with your goal in order to be successful with the campaign. And actually the inverse is often true. If you launch too early before you are assured of meeting your goal, you're putting the organization at risk and you're potentially putting your ability to actually reach that goal at risk. And we're going to talk about that a little more later. All right. The other misalignment we sometimes see on the leadership side is a lack of ownership over campaign success. We see this when an organization perceives that a campaign can be delegated to one person or one team of people, and the rest of the organization can kind of wash their hands of it, right? But we all know as fundraisers how important it is to have that support and active involvement from our CEO, that support and engagement from our board, because a campaign of the kind of size most organizations are looking at is an organization-wide endeavor. Pardon me, I'm going to take a sip of my water. A successful campaign can never be delegated to one fundraiser. It is always an organization-wide endeavor, right? So that's typically can be a misperception at a lot of organizations. All right, so I think the final thing I want to talk about, there are many ways that leadership can sometimes get misaligned, but I sometimes find that leadership can be reluctant to really dig into the details around specific gift size or timelines, right? We might set a goal based on need. Maybe we've even understood that we need to create a gift chart. For those of us newer to campaign planning, a gift chart is how you map out what size of gifts do I need to hit this goal at which level, and how many prospects do we need, right? But if your leadership team is avoiding getting specific about the details in that gift chart, and when I say that, that means I want to know which prospects you have access to that have the capacity to give that level of gift, right? We don't want a kind of mysterious gap, especially at the top of our gift chart, where we haven't really like drilled down to understand, do we have access to the prospects we need? Are we able to open doors to actually speak with folks who have the capacity to give this size of gift? So sometimes we kind of skim over the top. We need to get really specific about that as one simple example, as well as your timeline. We need to think about and make a commitment to, how long do we think this is going to take us? Typically, you see a lot of organizations doing sort of 3 to 5 year time frame, but we want to make sure that we're really, really clear on these details. This is so, so important right now because we are in such an uncertain environment. We really need to be thinking about good campaign planning and campaign readiness as good risk management for an organization, right? Gone are the days that you can just set a goal without kind of doing this thoughtful planning and be successful with it. So always recommend to folks, you want to make sure that you're thinking about a good planning process as key to your risk management. This is a really helpful way to frame things for your board and leadership as well. All right, so gap number 2, we see weak or overstretched major gift systems, right? You may experience this yourself. You may have a heavy reliance on too few major donors. You don't have enough prospects. You don't have access to enough prospects. You may not have a clear qualification or strategy to build out your major gift portfolio. I always recommend that you're really thinking about how do you strengthen these systems, because this is all going to come home to roost once you start actually getting out there to raise money. And I think the biggest challenge here and the biggest gap here that I see is that sometimes we're just layering a campaign right on top of a team that is already maxed out, right? A team that is already stretched really thin. So we need to understand that campaign, moving forward with a campaign, a capital or comprehensive campaign, is an investment in addition to the team that you already have. It's very unusual that you're not going to make some investment in infrastructure, in staff, and you need to really be thinking about that as a part of your campaign planning process and not just plonking it on top of what is typically already a maxed out team. All right, I know a lot of you know, feeling very stretched thin right now, right? So we need to understand, we need to invest in these systems, and we need to invest in our staffing as well. And a good readiness and planning process will help you uncover some of these gaps that are specific to your organization. All right, so number 3, I want to talk about overestimating donor readiness. We talked a bit about donor readiness earlier. And one thing that is really important is that just because a donor or a prospect has capacity, it does not mean that they're going to be interested in or committed to your campaign. Big gap and big mistake I often see is that the conversation is not had early enough with the potential donors. Or we go into it thinking, Jane Smith is absolutely going to love this, is going to be our lead donor. And we don't necessarily have the in-depth conversation with her as a part of our feasibility interviews. We don't have the in-depth conversation with her that we need to truly understand where Jane is at, right? And if this is a priority and where she sees herself landing in terms of giving to the campaign. So a good way to get around this gap and a really important thing to think about is what a lot of CEOs I say call the F word in campaign planning, and that is feasibility, right? So feasibility and having those conversations is a really important part of donor readiness. And the good news is that I am actually a firm believer in supporting teams and giving them frameworks and giving them the tools they need to actually have those feasibility conversations. Because I believe it's such a great opportunity to build those relationships with your donors. Why not have those conversations yourself effectively, right? But it does need to be something that you think about, that you structure well, that you structure carefully. Because we don't want to make assumptions about our donors. We don't want to just assume that they're going to step up, especially now. I see assumptions going one of two ways. People are making assumptions about donors. The most common way is, with the economy like it is, with political instability like it is, nobody's going to be interested in giving to a campaign of this size right now. So the conversation is never had in the first place, right? That's one way where assumptions can also impact your campaign planning. The other way it can impact is just making assumptions about people's interest in and involvement in the campaign without actually having that conversation with them. So absolutely, this is something we cannot skip over right now. I would say feasibility conversations are probably the most important thing you can do from a risk management perspective. Here's the fun thing also about feasibility conversations. In addition to this giving you the opportunity to deepen the relationship with your donor, you also are sometimes going to be discovering interesting things. Like you may have actually set your goal too low. I recently had a client who went out, had great, well-structured feasibility conversations with all of their donors, and the feedback they got is that they needed to aim higher with their goal. They needed to have a bigger vision. So instead of adjusting the goal down or going with the goal as proposed, the goal was actually increased, right? So now you can see like the positive outcomes. All news is good when it comes to well-structured feasibility conversations, because you'll have a better idea whether you can hit goal, whether you need to adjust it from a risk management point of view, or whether you're aiming too low and may actually be leaving money on the table. Because none of us want to do that. All right, so let's keep going and talk quickly, because I don't want to run out of time, about what are some of the costs of moving forward too soon without a good readiness assessment process, without a good planning process. Some of you may be here right now. I think, for the cost of the organization, staff burnout and turnover, to have one more thing layered on top without it being properly resourced for you can be very difficult, right? I think we can end up losing trust, not only with our staff team, but also with our donors. If we go out there, launch too soon, go public too soon, and we aren't actually able to achieve the goal that we're talking about, definitely ends up being resulting in lost trust, not just with donors, but also with your broader community. And quite frankly, a stalled campaign can actually really damage credibility, right? So if you're going ahead with a well-structured campaign, you have the opportunity along the way to adjust where you need to, because you may very well need to adjust. Just looking at the past few years, imagine if you were at an organization, perhaps you were, that launched just prior to the pandemic in 2020. If you launch too soon, it can be a very challenging conversation to have. But if you structure your campaign really nicely, it gives you the chance to go back to those donors who are closest to you, your closest partners, to have the conversation about what you're experiencing right now, what the challenges are, right? So really gives that insider experience as well to your donors and supporters. Cost of moving forward too soon, launching too soon, going ahead without a solid planning process for leadership, for the board, for the CEO, for the executive team. Really spending your political capital too early is a big risk. For CEO and board, you can end up with fractured board relationships. We don't want that. A lot of finger pointing can happen with the board saying, why are we running behind? You need to get out there and sort this out. That can be a result of not having that good leadership alignment. And also, finally, I would say like being forced into reactive decisions later can be a real downside and a real cost if you're launching and moving ahead too soon. So that is what I wanted to talk about today. And I also wanted to share with you some questions for leaders. If you've got leaders here on this call, maybe you're reporting into a leader, to a CEO or a board, maybe you are a CEO or a board member. Strong leaders ask tough questions, right? And they ask tough questions and they actually do the work and do the research before we're moving forward, and they're not making assumptions about donors. So tough question to ask is, are we as an organization really aligned on why we're doing this campaign, as well as what success looks like? And part of that conversation also has to be, what is everybody's role in this campaign? Because successful campaigns are an organizational wide endeavor. All right. What work do we need to actually do in the next 6 to 12 months to set this up for success? Another challenge, I see a lot of organizations rushing ahead and wanting to skip over a solid planning process, or maybe even contacting me and say, write us a plan. A good planning process is not just bringing someone in to write a templated plan. It is an organizational discussion. It's an assessment. It's having meaningful conversations with your team, with your donors, with your board, with your CEO. So you need to really think about what your gaps are and what actually needs to be in place over the next 6 to 12 months is a good kind of timeline to be thinking of to set your campaign up for success. Also, looking at the downside and looking at the risks, this does not hurt. I think it's a wise leader in this current climate that asks, what would it actually cost us financially, relationally, if this campaign stalled? And what can we do to actually mitigate that risk? Like I said, a good planning process, if you take away one thing, a good planning process has regular checks for risk management. They have checks for risk management during your feasibility conversations. The quiet phase before you go public is also a risk management strategy so that you're not going public too soon with a goal that needs to change, right? So good planning is a good risk management tool. And let's look at the other side is like, what are the costs and the risks based on good data if this campaign stalls? And finally, if we said not yet, what would be the smartest next step for us instead? What's our smartest next step? What priority do we want to set to focus on next? So, I'm going to take a breath here. And while I ask you for feedback and questions as well, I did want to share, we have a few more minutes together. I did want to share a tool that you may find helpful. It's a quick readiness check to have a look at your organization. I want to be clear, this is a quick check-in. It's not pre-planning, it's not a feasibility conversation, but it just will help you see, are there places we need to start focusing on to have a deeper conversation around our campaign readiness with our board and with our CEO. And it covers many of the areas that we talked about today. So if you want to download your free campaign readiness scorecard, I know if you're here live that Shanna just dropped the link. And it's blueskyphilanthropy.com/scorecard if you're catching up on the recording. Now, I would love to hear from you in the final couple minutes. What was the biggest takeaway from our conversation today? What is something that you want to bring back to your conversation, to bring back to your organization to explore further, right? Do you want to have a look at some of the pillars we talked about? Leadership alignment, donor readiness, your organizational systems and infrastructure. Is that something that jumped out at you? Do you want to talk a bit more about the board and CEO role in the campaign? Do you want to address the challenge that sometimes comes up around campaign success being delegated to one person or one team? So let me know, drop that in the comments. I'd love to know, what's your biggest takeaway today? Don't be shy. What's your biggest takeaway today? What would you like to bring back to work on in your organization? And this is also a great time, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop those in the comment as well. And I'm going to take a sip of water now because I talked a lot for the past half an hour. So let me know, your biggest takeaway, anything you'd like to take action on after our call today, and any follow-up questions you have around capital campaigns. Freya just shared, I really like, if we're not ready yet, what are the smartest next steps? I think that's a great question because the other challenge I see is actually organizations just deciding not to even explore this right now because they're worried, they're worried about the economy. So they actually, before even having the conversations internally and externally, put a pin in the idea of having a campaign at all. So I really like keeping that momentum going because absolutely there are organizations out there right now having successful campaigns. They're organizations in planning mode. They're organizations having those feasibility conversations with their donors. And donors are still giving significant gifts. So do not make assumptions based on the headlines, the news research. Always test this within your conversation with donors. Laura's sharing this idea of risk management and where and when are the checks during the campaign to ensure we don't stall. I have to tell you, when you're working with your board, that tends to really resonate with your board is seeing this idea of good, solid campaign planning and feasibility conversations, framing these as really important risk management factors. I found in my experience that really can resonate with boards for sure. And absolutely, Laura, like reducing the risk. Like we can never go into a campaign, a large campaign of any size at any time, and have no risk. Just simply doesn't exist. But we can, with a well planned process, actually minimize that risk and just be aware of, aware of and seeing challenges before they come down the road, right? All right, my friends. So let me know. We've still got a couple of minutes if you would like to, if you need to hop off. Totally understand that. But if you'd like to stick around and ask any further questions, Nan, thanks for joining us. And please go ahead, download this resource. Let me know what you think. Thank you for coming, Stephanie. Thanks for coming, Ruth. All right, everybody, and you know where to find me. Thanks so much for joining us today. Always appreciate this. And if you'd like more of this kind of session, let me know. Drop me a line because I'm always interested in what you like to hear about. I often do these kind of webinar sessions live on LinkedIn, but we moved over to Zoom this week because we had a bit of a technical challenge with LinkedIn last week. So we may actually consider doing more of these Zoom mini webinars if there's enough interest. All right, my friends, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.